Israel lied about murdered children to justify murdering children. Israel resumed its genocidal campaign of annihilation in Gaza early Tuesday morning, killing hundreds in a matter of hours, including many children. As of this writing, the death toll from this assault is reportedly at least 413. Israel is not even pretending that Hamas violated the ceasefire agreement it signed on to in January, saying instead that the decision to resume the onslaught was made because Hamas had been rejecting a significantly altered new agreement put forward by the Trump administration, which would have allowed Israel to postpone moving toward a lasting peace. A statement from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reads, "This follows Hamas's repeated refusal to release our hostages, as well as its rejection of all the proposals it has received from U.S. presidential envoy Steve Witkoff and from the mediators. Israel will, from now on, act against Hamas with increasing military strength," Netanyahu said. Of course, we all know Israel is not really acting against Hamas. Israel is acting against the entire population of the Gaza Strip. The plan to eliminate all Palestinians in Gaza has been openly confessed to by the President of the United States, who went as far as posting a freakishly disturbing AI-generated music video on social media about the future of Gaza after its U.S.-backed ethnic cleansing. Israel is simply making the enclave as dangerous and uninhabitable as possible so that everyone who lives there will be forced to either leave or die. And this was all planned in advance. As soon as the Gaza ceasefire agreement was announced, the Netanyahu-aligned pundits in Israeli media were already saying they knew for a fact that the Prime Minister wasn't going to allow the deal to move on to its second phase. After Netanyahu visited Washington and stayed for nearly a week, the Israeli outlet Haaretz reported that the Prime Minister was planning to sabotage the ceasefire deal upon his return. Now here we are, watching Netanyahu completely torch the ceasefire after weeks of actively sabotaging it. Not only was this all planned in advance, it was also propagandized for in advance. Israel and the Western political media class spent days pushing the atrocity propaganda narrative that Hamas had murdered child hostages Kfir and Ariel Bibas in the early weeks of the Gaza onslaught. Not just murdered them, but murdered them with their bare hands. Public outrage was deliberately drummed up around this narrative, despite no evidence ever being presented to the public that it was true. Western landmarks, like the Empire State Building and the Eiffel Tower, were lit orange at night in a transparent attempt to highlight the children's whiteness for Westerners who've been trained to ignore the deaths of darker Middle Eastern children. Israel supporters brayed for Palestinian blood as the babies on bayonets atrocity propaganda was pushed into their minds to manufacture consent for future atrocities. And it was all a psyop. Zedio's Mohammed Shahada reported a month and a half ago, weeks before the Bibas narrative was unfurled, that Israel's narrative managers appeared to be gearing up to use the Bibas kids to justify future bloodshed by pretending they didn't know whether the children were alive or not, swearing vengeance if they were dead. Hamas reported back in November 2023 that the Bibas children had been killed in an Israeli airstrike along with their mother. In December 2023, it was reported in the mainstream press that Hamas had offered to return their bodies to Israel, but Israel refused, telling the press that Israel will not address propaganda-based reports coming from Hamas. Lo and behold, the atrocity propaganda narrative about the Bibas children was rolled out a few weeks later when their bodies were returned by Hamas as part of the ceasefire agreement, just as Shahada had anticipated. And just last week, former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant admitted publicly that he had known the Bibas kids were dead the entire time, directly contradicting the feigned shock of Israel and its spinmeisters when the bodies of the children were returned. To this day, Israel has presented the public with no evidence of any kind that the Bibas siblings were murdered by the bare hands of their captors, rather than by the same Israeli airstrikes that were killing women and children every day in the same area as common sense would suggest. Given Israel's extensive history of lying about exactly this sort of thing, we can safely assume that the evidence was never presented because there isn't any evidence. They lied. They lied about murdered children in order to justify murdering children, just like they lied about beheaded babies on October 7th in order to justify killing thousands of babies in Gaza. When it comes to Israel, every accusation is a confession.